For 86 summers, Idora Park was Youngstown's million-dollar playground. On its biggest days, 25,000 people packed through the gates. John Philip Sousa played its ballroom. So did the Dorseys. Its coaster, the Wildcat, ranked among the best wooden coasters in the country. Then one spark from a welder's torch ended it. Over the next 17 years, fire hit this park 3 separate times. Nobody was ever charged. To understand how a place like that ends up as an empty, weed-covered lot, you have to go back to a summer when it wasn't even called Idora yet. It opened on May 30th, 1899 as Terminal Park. The name tells you exactly why it existed. It sat at the end of a streetcar line built by the Youngstown Park and Falls Street Railway Company, a company that sold streetcar rides, not entertainment. No admission was charged at the gate. You paid for rides, food, and games, but getting there in the first place cost a nickel and a streetcar ticket. The park existed to move people, plain and simple. That's the first quiet clue to everything that came later. The location looked like a gift. It sat in the Fosterville neighborhood on Youngstown's southwest side, tucked right next to Mill Creek Park, with its waterfalls and wooded gorges already drawing visitors on their own. A new bridge over the Mahoning River made the trip easier than ever. For a nickel, you could leave the mills and the row houses behind and step into somewhere that felt like an escape. It was small, it was walkable. It felt like it belonged to the neighborhood around it instead of being dropped on top of it. On opening day, the appeal wasn't complicated. There was a dancing pavilion, a vaudeville theater, a bandstand, swings, picnic tables under real shade trees, and an electric merry-go-round with animals carved by a Philadelphia craftsman named Gustav Denzel. None of it was extravagant. It didn't need to be. For families who spent their weeks inside mills and mill housing, a shaded park at the end of a trolley line was already something close to a luxury. Not long after opening, the park ran a public contest to name itself. The winning entry was Idora, credited to a local school teacher. Sources differ on whether her first name was Jean or Jessie, but the story stuck the same way either way. A park named by the town it served for the town it served. By 1924, that relationship became official. A group of local businessmen, Charles Dable, Rex Billings, and others, bought the park outright and formed the Idora Amusement Company. For the first time, Idora wasn't owned by a distant railway corporation chasing streetcar fares. It was owned by Youngstown. This wasn't a chain park stamped onto the landscape by someone in another state. It was theirs, and people treated it that way. And it earned that loyalty. In 1910, the park opened a ballroom so large it was billed, at the time, as the biggest dance floor between New York City and Chicago. In 1922, it added a hand-carved carousel from the Philadelphia Toboggan Company. 48 horses, carved by hand, spinning to a band organ that could be heard across the Midway. These weren't cheap additions. They were the kind of investment a town makes when it believes something is going to last for generations, not just a few seasons. But here's the detail almost nobody notices at the time, and it's the one worth remembering. Idora's greatest strength was also its cage. It was small, roughly 26 acres by the time it was fully built out, squeezed between a residential neighborhood on one side and a public park it didn't own on the other. There was nowhere to expand into, nowhere to grow. In 1899, that didn't matter. Nobody was thinking 50 years down the road. They were thinking about the next 4th of July. The following decades gave them plenty to think about. Idora built a reputation as more than just rides. It became the place where the whole region marked time. School trips ended there. Company picnics filled it every summer. Steel mills sent their workers and families through the gates by the thousands on their designated days. Whole shifts of men who'd spent the week in the mills bringing their kids through the same gates on a Saturday. In the 1920s, the park even hosted Negro League baseball games and Major League exhibition matches on grounds nearby. Another reason the whole region kept an eye on what Idora was doing. It was the kind of park where people grew up, had their first jobs, their first dates, and eventually brought their own children back through the same turnstiles their own parents had walked through. The dream that started with a streetcar company selling nickel rides had become something nobody in 1899 could have predicted. A piece of the town's identity. By the time Idora hit its stride, it wasn't just a nice local park anymore. It was competing, ride for ride, with the biggest names in the business, and for a while, it genuinely held its own. The signature ride arrived in 1929, built by the Philadelphia Toboggan Company and designed by Herbert Paul Schmeck, one of the most prolific coaster designers in the country. It opened for the 1930 season under a name that fit its reputation, the Wildcat. Depending on which account you trust, it stood somewhere between 85 and 95 feet tall and ran somewhere between 2,800 and 3,000 feet of wooden track. The exact numbers get fuzzy across decades of retelling. What doesn't get fuzzy is the reputation. Riders who'd been on coasters all over the country called the Wildcat one of the roughest, fastest, most unforgettable rides in America, right up until the day it closed. Alongside it ran the Jackrabbit, a coaster dating back to 1910, and the 1922 Carousel, which by 1975 had become the first carousel in the entire country ever listed on the National Register of Historic Places. The rest of the Midway filled in around those three. There was Kittyland, built where a saltwater swimming pool used to sit, complete with its own small coaster sized for little kids. There was the Lost River, a boat ride through a themed tunnel, the same tunnel that would later matter for a very different reason. There was the Wacky Shack Funhouse, the Kooky Castle Haunted House, a tilt-a-whirl, a scrambler, bumper cars, and a French fry stand people still talk about decades later. None of it was flashy by modern standards. All of it was exactly enough for a town that measured its summers by trips to Idora. The ballroom kept pace with the rides. Over the decades, it hosted Sousa's Band, Tommy and Jimmy Dorsey, Benny Goodman, and later the Glenn Miller Orchestra. Decades after that, it hosted the Eagles and the Monkees. In 1960, John F. Kennedy made a campaign stop there. This was not a small-town park quietly hoping for attention. Attention came looking for it. The crowds backed it up. Historian Rick Shale, who spent years documenting the park's history, put average daily attendance around 5,000 people. And on the biggest holidays, Decoration Day, the 4th of July, Labor Day, that number could climb to somewhere between 18 and 25,000 in a single day. Company picnic days brought entire mill workforces through the gates at once, fathers and mothers still in their good clothes from a shift that ended that morning, kids running straight for the Wildcat line. Every spring, a concert called the Spring Thing marked the unofficial start of summer for the whole region. Shale put it about as simply as anyone could. When Idora closed for the season, that was the end of summer. When it closed for good, people felt that same thing, except this time it was permanent. But underneath all of that noise and nostalgia, the same quiet flaw from 1899 was still sitting there, and it was getting more dangerous every year that passed. Idora was still landlocked, still boxed in on every side with no direction left to grow. And around the country, the rules of the amusement industry were changing fast. Cedar Point, Kings Island, Kennywood, these parks weren't just adding a ride here and there. They were building entire new sections, chasing families who wanted bigger, faster, and newer every single season. Idora couldn't do any of that. It had roughly the same acreage in the 1970s that it had decades earlier. The charm that made it feel intimate and walkable was the exact same thing that made it impossible to modernize. There was a second problem hiding in plain sight too, and it was made of wood. Nearly every structure in the park, the coasters, the ballroom, the game booths, the fun houses, had been built the old way, decades earlier, to the fire standards of an earlier era. It was a beautiful, aging wooden park, sitting inches away from a modern fire code nobody had ever forced it to meet. For now, that was just a fact sitting quietly in the background. Nobody was worried about it yet, but it was there, waiting. By the late 1960s and into the 1970s, the park was doing what aging, landlocked parks do, patching rides instead of replacing them, repainting instead of rebuilding, getting by on nostalgia because there wasn't room or money for much else. The rides that had felt cutting edge in 1930 were now, quite literally, historic. That was charming right up until it wasn't. And it was about to matter because the town that filled Idora's gates every summer was about to lose the one thing that made those gates worth walking through. On September 19, 1977, a date locals still call Black Monday, Youngstown Sheet and Tube announced it was closing its Campbell Works plant. Roughly 5,000 jobs disappeared almost immediately. Within 5 years, the ripple effect had wiped out an estimated 50,000 jobs across the Mahoning Valley. This is the part of the story that has nothing to do with roller coasters and everything to do with why the roller coasters stopped mattering. Idora didn't survive on tourists passing through. It survived on the region around it. Mill workers, their unions, their company picnics, their families with money left over to spend on a Saturday at the park. When the steel industry collapsed, that spending collapsed. Right along with it. For a while, the park held on anyway, but holding on isn't the same as being saved, and no rescue ever came. By 1982, Idora was formally up for sale, listed at $1.5 million. Nobody bought it. The park sat in limbo for years, its owners aging, its finances shrinking, its future undecided by anyone with the money to decide it. It's not always a dramatic villain who kills a place like this. Sometimes it's just silence. Nobody came. Then on April 26, 1984, the story took the turn that made it famous. And it's worth getting this part exactly right, because it's the detail most people get wrong. A welder's torch, working inside the Lost River Tunnel, sent a spark into the structure. The fire spread along the wooden track into the Wildcat, into the park office, into a row of game booths. 12 fire companies responded, dragging hoses across the same Midway families had walked down for 85 years. Firefighters spent hours specifically hosing down the roof of the carousel building, trying to keep the fire from reaching the one thing in the park that was already, quietly, irreplaceable. It worked. The carousel survived that day. The damage to everything else came to roughly $2.5 million. And this fire, for the record, was ruled accidental. Not arson, an accident on an old wooden park that had no modern defense against one. For a moment, there was defiance. Owner Patrick Duffy Jr. vowed the park would reopen, and it did, for one final wounded season. But the ride that had defined Idora for over 50 years was gone, and everyone quietly understood what that meant. The last public day came on Labor Day, though the exact date is remembered slightly differently across different records. Either way, that was it. That October, auctioneers ran a 2-day sale of everything the park owned. Bidders went after the carousel horses first, one at a time, some selling for tens of thousands of dollars apiece. Duffy died a few months later, In January of 1985, the man who'd promised a comeback didn't live to see the empty lot his park became. That should have been the end of the story. It wasn't. In 1985, Mount Calvary Pentecostal Church bought the 26 acres, and for a moment it looked like resurrection. The plan was ambitious, a religious complex called the City of God, complete with a nursing home, a gymnasium, a counseling center. It sounded massive. It sounded like the land had a future again. Almost none of it happened. The church struggled with debt, lost the property for a stretch in 1989, eventually got it back, and decades later, in 2017, filed for bankruptcy, owing roughly $1.6 million. The rescue plan never got past the announcement stage. While that plan quietly failed to materialize, the park itself just sat there, empty, wooden, waiting. Weeds pushed up through the cracked midway. The Jack Rabbit's track sat exposed to the weather with nobody left to maintain it. Vandals came and went through fences that were never really meant to keep anyone out. On May 3, 1986, fire hit it again, tearing through Heidelberg Gardens, the Kooky Castle Funhouse, and several other structures. Officials suspected vandals. Nobody was ever charged. The park was still standing, technically, but its identity was already gone. What remained was closer to a ghost town than a landmark. Broken pathways, faded signage nobody had bothered to take down. The outline of a midway with no midway left on it. The final blow came 15 years later, on March 5, 2001, when fire consumed the old ballroom, the same building once billed as the largest dance floor between New York and Chicago, now reduced to a burning shell in front of the people who still remember dancing in it. Officials called it suspicious. No one was ever arrested. Investigators looking at the scene never found a clean answer, and to this day, nobody officially knows who said it. One witness on the scene put it about as plainly as anyone could. This was literally history going up in flames in front of him. A few months later, on July 26, 2001, the city ordered what was left of the Wildcat and the Jack Rabbit torn down, not to erase the memory, but because the standing wood had become a fire risk all its own. The physical park, the one that opened in 1899 as a nickel streetcar attraction and grew into a regional landmark, ended there, 17 years after the first accidental spark started it all unraveling. 3 fires, 17 years. Nobody ever charged for any of them. Most people assume arson, start to finish, some clear villain lighting the match. The truth is stranger and less satisfying than that. 1 accident and 2 unsolved mysteries. Sitting on top of an economic collapse no fire hose could ever have stopped. So what's actually there now? If you go looking for the site today, you won't find a shopping center. You won't find new housing sitting where the Wildcat used to run. The land is still vacant, still owned by the church that once promised a comeback, sitting quietly beside Mill Creek Park the way it always has. The footprint is still there, grown over, foundations buried under grass and weeds, the outline of a place that used to hold 25,000 people on its busiest day. But not everything from Idora disappeared. The 1922 carousel, the one firefighter saved on the worst day of the park's life, survived the fires because it had already left. At that same 1984 auction, after the individual horses had already gone one by one, the whole carousel sold together, intact, for $385,000. The buyers were David and Jane Walentis, a New York couple developing what's now the Brooklyn neighborhood of Dumbo. Jane spent roughly 2 decades restoring it by hand, horse by horse, the same way it had been carved a century earlier. In 2011, it reopened inside a glass pavilion designed by the architect Jean Nouvel, right on the Brooklyn waterfront, under a new name, Jane's Carousel. It's still running, Strangers ride it every day, most of them with no idea it once spun in a park called Idora on the other side of the state. Other pieces survived closer to home. Jim and Tony Amy spent years collecting whatever they could find: coaster cars, signage, the old kiddie train, more than 1,000 artifacts in total, and built a private museum they called the Idora Park Experience. It sat in a converted space in Canfield for years, a labor of love that most visitors had to seek out on purpose to even know existed. That collection is now transferring to the Mahoning Valley Historical Society, which is putting together a permanent exhibit in downtown Youngstown, so the story has somewhere to live that isn't just an empty lot and a private garage. And the memory itself never really left. Every year, walkthroughs of the old grounds sell out in minutes, sometimes within 20 minutes of tickets going live. People still show up just to stand where the ballroom used to be, where the coaster used to run, pointing out landmarks that exist only in their heads now, describing a Ferris wheel or a ticket booth to their own kids who never saw any of it standing. Rick Shale said it best: everybody who grew up around here has an Idora story. First dates, first jobs, family picnics, an entire town's worth of summers, all tied to 26 acres that technically don't hold anything anymore. It's worth sitting with how strange that is. Most failed businesses just disappear from memory along with their buildings. Idora didn't. The park has been gone longer than most of its longtime visitors can remember it being open, and people still line up for a chance to walk a patch of empty grass. That's really the whole shape of this story. A streetcar company built a park to sell tickets, and it turned into the heartbeat of a town's summer. The very smallness that made it lovable made it impossible to modernize. An accident took its signature ride. An economic collapse took its audience. 2 more fires, never solved, took whatever was left standing. What's left today is empty ground next to a public park, quiet, grown over, indistinguishable from any other patch of grass in Youngstown. But 400 miles away, in a glass pavilion on the Brooklyn waterfront, the one piece of Idora that made it out is still turning. Kids climb onto the same horses that were carved by hand in 1922, that spun for mill workers and their families on company picnic days, that survived a fire it was never even damaged by. They have no idea where it came from. It doesn't matter. It's still spinning. That's more than the rest of the park can say.